Hi all, I'm Keanen McKinley, and this is my presentation, Missing Data Reporting Practices, Surveying the Internationalization Literature. And just a big picture, we're looking at how scholars, or I'm looking at how scholars address missing data within the literature on the internationalization of higher education. So missing data is an inescapable problem in educational research. So this presentation, this project is really focusing on quantitative data and how to handle missing data. I'll get into some of the kind of theory behind it a little bit just to kind of explain why missing data is an issue. But mishandling missing data can lead to distorted parameter estimates, reduced statistical power because you're using a smaller sample size, and then really ultimately imprecise conclusions from the data that you have. And missing data can be generally categorized in two ways: item non-response and total non-response. So if I were to administer a survey and someone decided not to answer a particular question, that would be a form of item non-response. And if someone decided not to respond to the survey at all, then that would be a form of total non-response. So kind of the context for this study is internationalization of higher education, or just often referred to as internationalization because the name is so long. But what it's really concerned with is it's a process of integrating international, intercultural, or global dimension into higher education. And internationalization often brings to mind study abroad or education abroad, but it really can also concern students at home. So kind of a response to study abroad and education abroad are concepts like internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum. So really looking at a university, a campus, really holistically. So it is a broad field. So obviously scholars in the past have reviewed literature, but no review that I've come across has really focused on missing data, which is kind of the literature gap that my study is going to fill. And then kind of relating this back to the importance of missing data, the scholars in this field often rely on small survey samples. So if they're not handling missing data properly, then they're going to have a smaller sample size, an even smaller sample size, which might make it harder to kind of draw meaningful conclusions. So kind of getting into the theory about missing data mechanisms. Rubin's seminal work classified missing data in three ways. There's missing completely at random, missing at random, and missing not at random. And the naming, the conventions, it is a bit confusing. So I'm not going to get too much in the weeds here, but missing completely at random it's a very strong assumption. You're assuming a lot when you state that you believe your data is missing completely at random. Missing at random is often what scholars have been kind of focusing on or looking at how to handle that. Missing not at random, it often depends on the study at hand, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. So that's a really brief overview. But what these mechanisms are, each of these mechanisms kind of tell you what kind of methods are appropriate for handling the missing data at hand. So oftentimes traditional methods use MCAR, but some of the more modern methods allow for the relaxed assumption of missing at random. So this presentation will focus more on 1 and 2. So traditional methods include list-wise deletion. This is where if a case has any missing data at all, then it's removed. So you're only dealing with cases that have data for every item that you've requested the respondent to answer or provide. Pairwise deletion is a little bit of an improvement because you're trying to use you're trying to keep cases depending on the analysis at hand. So you might have uneven numbers across the different type of analyses that you do, but you're trying to use all the data that you have. And then single imputation, this is replacing a value with a single value, like the mean of the variable. So if you have a variable x and it's missing some data, you can take the data that you have, calculate the mean, and then use that mean and put it in place of all the missing data points. So those are that's a really quick overview of the traditional methods. These all rely, again, on the MCAR assumption, which is a strong assumption. So it often can lead to biased results. So just to I think it's helpful to give kind of a visual presentation of some of these. I'm not going to go into each one, but this is a data set. It's not really too important to know for this example. It's not really too important to know the different variables in here, but we have two variables with a correlation of 0.4, and this is a complete data. It's kind of a very small, quick simulation. So what's going to happen on the right-hand side, I'm going to make this using MAR data, the missing at random data. You'll see on the right-hand side, some of the data is going to go away. So that's going to be our missing data. And instead, we have the mean imputation here, where you can see it's a straight line where the mean values have been imputed. And you can kind of see just visually, without having to go into the math behind it, what happens to the variance with those missing data. This is regression imputation, so this is another form of single imputation. You can see it's a little better because it has that slope to it, but the variance obviously has been reduced, and that can lead to distorted relationships between the variables. So that's a really quick overview of some of the traditional methods. So modern methods are maximum likelihood and multiple imputation. They're often considered the state of the art right now. A whole lot going into the details about it too much. But these, compared to the traditional methods, they rely on missing at random. So there's kind of that relaxed assumption about why the data is missing. And then these methods, because you have the assumption of missing at random, you're able to theoretically produce unbiased estimates and avoid discarding your data. So just recap, you got the traditional methods and modern methods. Oftentimes, scholars kind of rely on the traditional methods because these modern methods have been improved over the last, several decades, but there's been advances so that these are kind of becoming more frequently incorporated into software, so it's easier for researchers to do. But in the past, scholars have often relied on traditional methods because that's what software did, and that's what was kind of easiest at the time. And it's still the easiest, but as we've seen, that can lead to imprecise conclusions. So the purpose of this study is to determine the missing data reporting practices within the internationalization literature. So the research question I'm trying to answer is, there's kind of two parts to it. How often do internationalization scholars explicitly state their methods for handling item non-response, and what methods do they tend to use? And then the second part of the study is going to briefly compare the performance of traditional and modern methods. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. It's going to be kind of informed by what I find in the first part with the literature review. But some of the charts I showed earlier, that's kind of the beginnings of what I'm hoping to do with my findings from the first half in the literature review itself. So to answer my research questions, I'm reviewing articles published from 2016 to 2020, so 5 years, in the Journal of Studies in International Education, which is a leading journal in the field. And I'm focusing on studies with a quantitative survey, and then I'm using content analysis to determine the methods that scholars use. And it's been kind of difficult because a lot of scholars don't really address missing data within the work. So for this, there's not a whole lot to present. These are the preliminary results. So I've looked at 2 years of data. The sample size is 19 studies. So there were 17 articles, but there's 19 studies because 2 studies used 2 surveys. 3 articles did address missing data, but as I mentioned earlier, the methods have been difficult to determine because they don't really address missing data. So oftentimes, so for first, just the quick results, 10 of the studies could not be determined what kind of method they used. 6 used listwise deletion, and then 3 used pairwise deletion. An example of the could not be determined, the scholars might present their survey findings saying 100 students participated in the survey, and then they get into the analysis. So they don't really mention missing data at all. So that's why it's been difficult to determine. And I'm doing all that. I'm putting that into matrices where I I state the method and I kind of provide evidence. So those would be, depending on where this gets published, they'd be either provided as supplemental material, or they'll be available for scholars to request them from me for their reference. Some of the findings, scholars often refer to valid or usable data, and they appear to be discarding data. So from what I can tell with the methods, they often use again the deletion methods where they're discarding that data. So something that I've started to think about in the discussion and when I present these findings is, what exactly do valid and usable mean to these scholars, and how can they be defined for readers? Is it just a kind of a blanket statement where it's more just about convenience? So those terms will have to be, from my personal view, I think those terms should be kind of avoided when you're talking about missing data. Should be a little more, I guess, formatted, a little more technical than just stating whether they're valid or usable. And then scholars may be relying on software protocols to handle the missing data, which may be one reason that these scholars aren't addressing missing data. They're kind of relying on what the software does automatically behind the scenes, which isn't really a good thing. So the way I present it, I'll be careful how I present it, but scholars should be taking a little more care about how they address missing data. So that's kind of the research implications. For the internationalization field as a whole, in 2015, the definition of internationalization was kind of updated among several leading scholars in the field. And the new definition emphasizes that efforts should be more inclusive. And I think by not addressing missing data properly, you're discarding the data, you're discarding the perspectives of respondents. And it's important for scholars to remember that some survey respondents may be hesitant to share sensitive information. So, for example, international students may be considered a potentially vulnerable population, as we've kind of seen with the pandemic and in the past. So really making sure to be inclusive includes also kind of bringing that spirit to the methodologies that scholars use to approach their work. So not just in the definition, not just in the concepts, but also in the research methods also need to be inclusive, and making sure we're capturing all the perspectives, all that data, and then making the most of it. So if you're interested in doing kind of a similar, maybe a similar study for your field, I thought I'd highlight some recommended readings, even if you just want to learn more about missing data, since I've obviously been trying to make the case that it's important to handle missing data appropriately. So Allison's paper, or it's a short book, but Allison's book, it's a really short 80-page book that kind of gives a nice overview of it. If you want to get into the details about it, Enders, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, I haven't actually heard it, but he gets into more of the technical details about how to handle the data properly. For the first, Graham is an article that kind of gives a quick overview. Well, it's not quick, but it's an overview of missing data practices and approaches that researchers can take. If you want to learn a little more about internationalization of higher education, Knight's paper is a pretty good place to start. And if you're really looking to do, or considering, or just kind of toying with the idea of doing a similar study, Pugh and Enders, that's kind of what got me interested in doing this. So they reviewed the literature and kind of looked at the different methods. So then these are my references. I'll just pause here in case someone needs to take a screenshot or something. And then this is slide 2 of 2 for the references. So that concludes my presentation. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And thank you again for tuning in.